Hello, I'm Dr. Breach Burke, and welcome to this week's lecture, which is going to be on the mythology of the underworld. Now, depending on where you're taking this course, this is at the university. This will be the only class that I have on the underworld. This is just the one thing, just giving you a overview of concepts connected with the underworld and going over some of the major figures of the Greek/Roman underworld and who they are and what their roles are. For people taking other versions of this course, particularly through my private teaching in my other school, there's going to be a second part to this that goes into a lot more detail about things like Dionysus, the mystery cult, Orphism, cult of Eleusis, cult of, and those, the Bacchic cults and things like that. So I will have another class that covers that. But for these purposes, this is just meant to be an introduction to the concepts that are associated with the underworld, both psychological ones and the really the whole point of this lecture is to give you a good basis and background for understanding why the underworld is probably not what you think it is. We have certain ideas, as we're going to talk about. So let me start by sharing my presentation here and hitting play. Okay. Okay, so we have this conception of life after death that if people who believe that, there's people, of course, who believe that you die and that's it, and there's nothing. But if you do believe that there's life after death, you may, depending on what culture you are, if you're from an Eastern culture, somewhere in Asia, particularly Hinduism or Buddhism, you may think that you are reincarnated, and that's a whole different idea. In the West, there's this concept of heaven and hell in particular that has stuck. And that is very much a Christian concept that has adopted and flowed into other religions over time. And it's based on the idea of judgment after death. So if you were a good person, here as we say, good souls go away to ceiling cat. This is very dated, this particular meme. This is the old, what they used to call the lolcats, which, gosh, I think this was really a big thing like in 2001. So it's at least 20 years old. But I still love it because, they'd show a big fluffy white cat and that would be ceiling cat. And then they'd show a black cat and that was basement cat. So ceiling cat, basement cat. And so here we see the good souls go to ceiling, and this makes a point too, because the good souls rise up away from the earth, okay, away from the chthonic realm, and the bad souls go under the earth somehow. But as we will see, that was not always the case. Yes, and there was this idea that of good versus evil, that there's the white cat who represents, the good. There's other versions of this meme where he's acting, there's a white cat actually sticking its head out of a ceiling tile, like, from, those movable ceiling tiles. And then you have the black cat down below. So, because we also have this moral judgment connected with life after death. And I think there's people assume, especially because Plato speaks in these terms, that, I've seen very scholarly authors who've written and said, oh, well, this was always an idea. And I'm here to tell you, no, it wasn't. Now, the ancient Egyptians did have ideas of judgment after death, but again, they're not quite the same. Ancient Egyptians, typically there was the idea that, yes, the righteous were the ones, because they were becoming, especially because initially life after death was reserved for the pharaoh or for the king. And the king had to show that he had been a worthy king, worthy to be among the gods, which was the concept. The average person didn't live among the gods. It wasn't until the days of what they call the coffin texts that you start to see a shift in this, in the later kingdoms of Egypt. And then of course, then you start to have the idea of your heart being weighed against a feather and so forth, where these ideas become prominent. But even then it was just, if you could recite the right formula, it didn't actually matter whether you were good or not. So here, we're going to talk about the chthonic realm in ancient Greece, because chthonic realm is where everybody goes when they die. You get buried in the earth, your body's in the earth, and so is whatever's left of you. Now, the word chthon, I get a lot of questions about Chthoniya. A lot of people don't know what it means. That's the name of my podcast. And Chthoniya is the feminine ending, and it has to do with feminine attributes of the underworld. So chthon literally means earth. And you can quibble. James Hillman, who is a post-Jungian writer, has often said, well, chthonic isn't really the same as earth, that they're different. For our purposes, they're related, okay? It's an adjective that's used to refer to the deities of the underworld, and often it includes earth and fertility deities. They're the chthonic deities. They're not the Olympian deities, or they're not the celestial. The celestial and chthonic are often used as antonyms, as opposites of each other. So celestial, those who rise up to the sky, the chthonic are the ones under the earth. And certainly when we are living in, in a Christian paradigm, anything under the earth, especially since Dante's Inferno, or Dante's whole Divine Comedy, the idea of anything that's under the earth is related to hell or to the demonic, which is definitely not the case in ancient history. So let's look at some of the Near East ideas. Now, I say Near East, I'm talking about Greece and Rome, but we are also talking about Babylon, we're talking about Sumeria, all these same areas where we have looked at the creation myths and so forth. They're all close to each other. Asia Minor, Anatolia, the Hittites area, what's now modern Turkey, that whole area, that whole peninsula area right there. Egypt is a little bit different, as I've noted, but their history is also a lot older. Their civilization and its writings and its history come from probably at least 1,000 years before this, if not more. Okay, so it's not certainly there's a lot in Egyptian afterlife I guess you could call it a theology that later influences certainly influences the philosophers. But the original ideas, and this includes the Hebrews, by the way, or the Jews. This was when you're talking about the ancient Jews around 9,000 BCE, you're talking about sharing, and even later than that, you're talking about sharing this similar belief. So, what are the 5 things here? So first, we talk about the dead continuing to exist, but in a less energized form. This is not the same as immortality. Okay, as I mentioned in point 3, you're separate from the gods or from God. You're not dying and going to live with God. You're not. This is not happening. You don't. The ancient Greek person who dies doesn't go up on the Mount Olympus and hang out with the gods. They're not. They're separate, and it does not matter who they are. They exist in this cavernous world under the earth or under the sea. You'll always find that the underworld is located in places like that, and we'll look at some of the places up ahead. So yes, you're not immortal. You are some less energized. It's kind of like if you have a very bright light bulb and then it's kind of just down to a flicker. That's you after you die. You're just like a little flicker. So there's always this cavernous world, depending on the place, there's different attributes, and we'll talk about that. And there's no punishment after death. You're going to this gloomy place, but it's not because you were bad. You're going to this gloomy place because death stinks. It's just how it is. It's not the same as being alive. And, so it's just, and it doesn't matter whether you're the lowliest slave or the greatest hero of the Trojan War, everybody goes to the same place. Okay. And of course, in this, the living can communicate with the dead. So that is actually a feature of the dead, is that they, for some reason, they're kind of in this shadow world, but they can see what's going to happen. They know they're somewhat aware of what's going on in the earth. But that's why frequently necromancy is very popular. The idea of raising the dead or getting an oracle from the dead, because that just seems to be a very common thing that, and not just in the Near East, that the dead are able to tell you the future. So let's look at each one of those separately. Okay, first of all, the forms of the dead. In Hebrews, you have the idea of the Nefesh Met and the Rephaim. Okay, Rephaim means weak ones. Okay, that literally is a word that means weak ones. And my Hebrew is no better than anything else. So if I've said that incorrectly, apologies to Jewish friends and those who know better. It's basically a word that means the weak ones. And Nefesh Met, that's basically the state of your soul at the moment of death. Okay, there's there's a couple of different I'm trying to remember what the opposite is. I think I want to say it's nefesh hayat or it's something like that, but that's the idea of the soul while you are alive versus what you become when you're dead. So this is like your light. Your light hasn't totally gone out, but it's gone down to just a little point. You see Rephaim used also for that's another term for the Nephilim, for the giants. And the idea there is who are mentioned in the flood myth. But what it is that they're weak ones, say, compared to Yahweh, they're weak ones. So sometimes it's when they're sent to the underworld, it's the idea that they are not as powerful as Yahweh. Okay, but nonetheless, that's sometimes you'll hear that term used there as well. Now in Babylon, you have the dead are terrifying and malevolent ghosts. A lot of times they talk about them, sometimes as winged creatures. But the dead are terrifying. You don't want to encounter them because they are very angry. They're very upset about being dead. And in Rome, it's the same thing. I don't know of a specific name that's given to the dead in ancient Babylon. When you read largely translations, I don't know that there probably is a particular term in the original Babylonian cuneiform script that describes the dead. But they're just considered to be that they're angry and you don't want to encounter them. In Rome, you have the Manus and the Lemures, and they're actually quite similar to the Babylonian in the sense that they are they're again not happy about being dead. One of the reasons that you bring gifts to the ancestors and tend the graves and so forth, because that's the idea too, is that your body or whatever form it's in, cremated or burial, is in this tomb, and the idea that somehow the food and things that they provide somehow still feed you in some fashion in the other world. And this is also where we eventually we have the practice of going to graves and putting flowers on a grave. I mean, it's the idea of remembering or memorializing the dead or giving them some kind of a vitality from this world. But oftentimes in ancient Rome, like festivals like Lemuria were done to appease the dead, to keep them from following you home and trying to stay in your house because you don't want the dead in your house. Just like now. Well, some people do. If you're a big paranormal fan, or you're like, yeah, all right, there's a ghost. As long as they're not a bad ghost, people don't care. Although, you have to admit, people are kind of creeped out by the idea of somebody being in your house and watching you all the time, and you can't see them. Could be kind of, I've always found that bit about it unsettling. I don't know if I care about too much else, but that idea would be unsettling. Nonetheless, yeah, there was, and there were very elaborate rituals in ancient Rome to keep the dead out of your house. Again, if you're taking this through Scholars of the Borderland, which is my private, my other school, I actually do have an entire class that goes into great detail on mythology of the underworld, including those kinds of details. So that's a separate subject for those who want to take that. Okay, in ancient Greece, there are two names for the soul. I should mention that the Egyptians have quite a few of them. I want to say there's at least 6 or 7 different names for the soul, depending on what state it's in. But the Greeks, they have the psyche or the psyche, which is the breath of life at moment of death, and then something called the eidolon, which is basically the smoky, phantom-like image of you. And we'll look at some examples of that in here. Okay, yeah. The locale of the underworld, okay, you have the Hebrews or the Jews talk about Sheol. You'll mainly see Sheol mentioned. If you're looking in the Bible, for example, in Proverbs, you'll see Sheol mentioned quite often. And Sheol is the pit. The term Sheol, what it actually means is not entirely clear. There's definitely the sense of it being a pit, a cave, or opening of some kind. From what I recall, there's a kind of almost a feminine connotation to the idea of Sheol, but nonetheless, it's when you die, you go to this sort of pit or cave underground. Okay, that is where the dead go. And again, doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter if you're the lowliest Israelite. Doesn't matter if you're Moses or Abraham. Everybody goes to the same place. That was the idea. The Egyptians had the idea of duat, which is they conceived of the idea of kind of a flat earth, and that the underworld was like on the flip side of it, like a mirror image. It was like on the flip side. And yeah, you passed through this realm, this dark watery realm called Duat. And the worst thing that could happen to an Egyptian soul is not the idea is that you just kind of live like you did in life, but you live there instead. And this was the more what's the right word? The more democratic version of the underworld, as opposed to the one that's just for royalty. That you went there. But the worst thing that could happen to you is that you would be attacked by their equivalent of monsters or demonic creatures. I don't like the word demon because I find it to be a misleading term, but people often use it. And it's the idea of these beings that would attack and devour your soul so that your soul ceased to exist at all. That was the worst thing that could happen to you. Okay. The Babylonians refer to both Aralu and Kigal, and they're both references to the West, to a land far off to the West. Their idea of the underworld locale is more like it was a desert. And when you read the Gilgamesh, the underworld is described as a dusty place. You know, like you ever see those images of like the really haunted house with big cobwebs, that's kind of their view of the underworld. And the idea was that the souls, they were winged like birds. The term bird, actually, the term anima for soul actually comes from the word for bird, or for, that which flies. There's always this idea of the soul as somehow taking flight. And that's, excuse me, that's another interesting sort of feature of that. Now, in the ancient Greece, yes, we refer to the underworld as Hades. It's named after Zeus's brother, who is actually the king of that realm. Okay, sometimes he's also called Ides, Aides, is somehow another way his name is spelled. You'll see that reference occasionally, but that is also referring to Hades. Okay, that is the Greek underworld. And Romans refer to it as Dis. I think I did read to you from a text where it was referred to the souls that were in Dis or Pluto. Sometimes also the term Inferni, which implies a fiery place. Okay, but that again, that's a much later term for the Roman underworld. By the time you're getting to the time of the Roman Empire and beyond, then it might be referred to as Inferni. But often it's referred to as Dis or Pluto. Pluto, again, which is the Roman name for Hades. And I think I've mentioned is a reference, there's a relationship between that word and Pluton or Plusos, which is actually a Greek word. And that refers to wealth, or the kind of, jewels and gold and the kind of things that you dig out of the earth. Okay. So in a way, it's a nice name. Just like Manus is also meant to be a nice name for the dead, because Manus means kindly ones. Okay. And the idea is that, when the dead is angry, you call them by a nice name so that they don't attack you. It's in the same way that if a dog is snarling at you and you go, "Oh, nice doggy," you try to placate with nice terms. So here, Pluto may be a conciliatory term to the idea of, the king of the underworld as being wealthy, as having all these riches. So it's very interesting. Just as a side note, the Hindu underworld, which we're not getting into in this class, there's kind of 7 layers under the earth, but the underworlds are said to be more beautiful than the world above, and they're ruled over by the Nagas, or the serpents. Serpents all live underground. And they said the jewels are so resplendent that the light there is brighter than that of the sun. So very interesting parallel there. Okay, no immortality. Okay, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh talks to, he's going to look for his friend Enkidu, who has been killed. Through Ishtar, she has managed to have him killed. And so he is going to look for her, for him. He wants to go find his friend in the underworld because he's inconsolable. And he runs into a barmaid who tells him, "Oh, Gilgamesh, give up your quest. Death the gods dispensed to mankind, but life they kept for themselves." In other words, you don't want to go to the world of the dead. Be here, enjoy your life now, because you don't want to go to the underworld. You don't want anything to do with it before you have to. But they mentioned, but that's the fundamental and key thing. Death is something for humans, and death is a permanent state. There's not an idea of immortality. There's not the idea that your soul lives on. I mean, it kind of does, but it's in a very, very weakened kind of a state. Okay. And then, of course, when we talk about the Psyche, or really the Eidolon, because the Psyche is the piece of you in Greece that kind of flies away and goes off to wherever. That's never really quite made clear. Plato tries to come up with his own ideas of what happens there, but he has a different conception of the underworld. But the Eidolon is really, when we read, for example, the book called the Nicaea in the Odyssey. So book 9, I think it's book 12. I want to say it's book 9 or 12. I always get the numbers mixed up because I get it mixed up with the Aeneid. I think the Aeneid is 8 and the Odyssey it's 12. Nonetheless, it's the book where Odysseus goes with Circe or Circe, the sorceress, and they go to they do a necromantic ritual to call up the prophet Tiresias, so that he can come and tell Odysseus how to get home, because Odysseus is stuck. He can't get home. So when he visits her, she says, well, let's call up the prophet from the dead. Let's raise the dead and let's find out. So when they go to this cave, which is an entrance to the underworld, all these dead souls come forward because there's a pool of blood, a sacrificial pool of blood that they want Tiresias to drink from so that he can have enough energy to speak. And when they do that, Odysseus sees all these floating shades of people that he's known, including his own mother. And when he goes to actually embrace his mother, she's just smoke. She just disappears. And he says, is this some terrible trick of Persephone? Persephone being the queen of the underworld. And she says, no, my son, it's not a trick. It's just, this is what we are, the soul, she says, the way she describes it is, this is all that's left of us here. The soul flies insubstantial. So she talks about the idea of the Psyche flying away and that this shadow is all that's left. And the only way to give life to that shadow is to feed it blood, because blood is associated with life. Okay. Now, Heracles is an interesting, I mentioned Heracles here because Odysseus mentioned seeing Heracles in the underworld. And he says, well, but it's just his shadow. It's just the Eidolon. That's all that you see of Heracles, because Heracles is he's really a demigod because his father is Zeus, but he's the only one made immortal and allowed to live on Mount Olympus. He is the exception because of his 12 labors. Because he is an extraordinary human. He's not really human. He's like a superhuman. He ends up going to Mount Olympus, and he's married to Hebe, the cupbearer of the gods, the girl who's the daughter of Zeus and Hera. So so Heracles is the example. The exception. He's the only one that becomes immortal. So what's happening here is that he is, but yet nonetheless there is that shadow of him that still exists in the underworld. So that's very curious. Even that part of him becomes immortal, but there's still a part of him that's not. So it's like that mortal part of him still has to go there. So interesting idea. Not the way we would think about the soul now. And I want to mention the Elysian fields versus the depths of Tartarus, because sometimes people try to say, well, that's really the heaven and hell. Not really, no. I understand in the sense that the Elysian fields is beautiful. It's supposed to be beautiful fields with plenty of food and flowing. It's like it's like if you were going to be on Earth and have a nice life, the Elysian fields have that kind of feel and quality to it. And typically this is where the heroes or, those very much favored by the gods were sent to the Elysian fields. Those who joined the mystery cults had their formulae so that they could say all the right passwords and get themselves into the Elysian fields. It's kind of like the VIP club, The rest of Hades is gloomy. Tartarus is not where the rest of the people go, though. Tartarus is a realm really deep under the earth. It's an actual void, a dark abyss. And that is where the Titans are kept. That's where the giants are. That is and the only times there's punishment, I think there's only maybe 5 or 6 examples in Greek mythology of people being punished and being put in Tartarus. Like there's Sisyphus, there's Ixion, there's the giants who actually tried to seduce. Ixion got in trouble for trying to seduce Hera. Don't you dare try to seduce the queen of the gods, because Zeus will get you. Ixion's chained to a fiery wheel for all eternity. Sisyphus pushes his rock up the hill. They're generally being people who have, in some exceptional way, have tried to either overthrow the gods or have just angered them so much by violating some kind of a really serious taboo, that they are confined to Tartarus. It takes something extraordinary. There's the pair of giants who start piling up rocks to try to climb to Mount Olympus, and eventually are taken down, I think, by Artemis. But they are, they are also confined to Tartarus. You can't, it takes something really awful to be confined to Tartarus. The average human being, even if they weren't a great person, doesn't get confined to Tartarus. But the rest of the underworld is just kind of a gloomy place that you wander around. Gloomy, cavernous place. Okay, so the idea of no punishment. Yes, I just talked about this. Only the very wicked receive punishment after death. Again, the Titans in the war against Zeus, and those mortals who committed really flagrant violations against Zeus. And there's not many of them. There's only a handful. So that's the only example of that in Greek mythology. Okay, so the idea of bringing back the dead, the goete, or goite. The word approximately translates to howling, which is the sound that they supposedly made. Now, the way that the rituals are described, when you are doing celestial rituals, to the celestial gods that are up in the heavens, everybody would come, they would wear white, or they'd wear bright clothes, and the sacrifice would be burned on an altar, and the smoke would rise up to the gods. So this was it would be an affair of light, where things were sent upwards. When you do chthonic rituals to deities of the underworld, people generally wore sackcloth and ashes. Their hair was a mess. The rituals were aimed down. You dug a pit, you put the sacrificial animal in it, and you slit its throat, and the blood went down. The idea is that goes down. And at the time of death, you also had people who would be howling and carrying on the practice of keening, as they call it. At the funerals, where you'd always have the women who would be weeping and wailing. And in some cultures, they would actually hire women to do that. That's their job. But the keening is not just trying to show that they're sad about the person dying. The keening is actually meant to be a kind of ritual to help bring the dead person. It's like the sound of the howling guides them to the underworld. Okay, so that's the idea. Now the goete knows how to do this kind of howling, this special howling, but they not only use it to help get rid of the dead. So your dead uncle is now haunting your house and bothering you. The goete comes and tries to placate him and lay him to rest, in kind of the way the modern exorcist might, or somebody like that, or psychic medium or paranormal group, or only the goete is not doing it quite that way. But the goete is the one who has to send the dead back to the underworld, but also has the power to bring the dead back from the underworld. So they can raise the dead to get prophecies. Usually that's what it is, either prophecies or to find out if there's something they need or whatever. But the dead typically didn't like being bothered in this fashion because it was it was troubling for them. And generally you had to offer them something to placate them. Like if you come back and tell me this thing, then I will do this thing for you. But generally, if there was some kind of a problem where there was an anger, there's one account from Rome where the dead woman is brought back and she's angry because something about her clothes. There's just something she doesn't like, that she needs, she either wants to be buried with her clothes or she doesn't want a certain person to have them. Like there's some kind of a thing, but it's the goete who has to find out, or sometimes it's a witch figure, but it's a goete who is sent to find that out. The goete, there might be a link between them and the shamans of archaic societies. My understanding is that they're not exactly identical. Because the goete is not really a healer person. And the way a shaman is tends to have a kind of healing function and tends to be somebody with a foot in both worlds. The goete is more somebody who is, he's kind of a diviner, or a person to do oracles or to deal exclusively with the dead, which the shaman doesn't necessarily do. But the question then becomes, I remember reading some writings, my entire book, Death and the Maiden, I go into great detail about exactly everything we're talking here in some of the introductory chapters. And one of the things about one of the things that the ancient Greeks had said, I remember reading a writing from about the 6th century where, and I can't remember now who it is because I don't have the paper in front of me. I can't remember who had said it, but basically trying to imply that the practice of this necromantic practice, or the goethe, was something that originated in Persia. And people were very fond of saying everything originated in Persia. Oh, that's not our practice. That's theirs. They brought that here. But as it's been pointed out, I think Sarah Iles Johnson makes a mention of this in one of her books, possibly The Restless Dead. She's one of the only scholars who deals exclusively with the Greek underworld. And she had said that, if such a practice did come from somewhere else, it had to be important enough that they considered, that they, wanted to bring it here. You can't just, they didn't adopt practices from other cultures unless they really felt there was a good reason for it. Yes, in fact, I think there's an entire chapter in her book called "To Honor and Avert." It's the idea of, we respect the dead, but we kind of respect you over there. Don't come here. But so the goethe was also always treated with some fear and suspicion because of their ability to do this. Okay, so let's look at Jung for a minute on ghosts and spirits. Now, Jung says 2 specific things about life after death. And he raises the question that is perpetual in people who, particularly in people who practice magic and so forth. But there's this idea of, he says, there do exist well-documented cases of ghosts. Question is whether they're identical with the dead person or a psychic projection, and whether things said really derive from the deceased or from the knowledge that may be present in the unconscious. So are they unconscious projections, dead people, or are they actual actual embodiments of your consciousness? And I don't think Jung is trying to imply that the answer is one or the other. He just says we don't know. And anybody who engages in, I know people who engage in archaic necromantic practices today, and they would tell you that the spirit itself has a reality. They said it's not merely, okay, first of all, though, I should say that saying that something's a projection from the unconscious is not mere. Projections from the unconscious are often extremely powerful and traumatizing and can impact on the environment. So it's not, we only tend to say, oh, it's just a projection. It's definitely, it sounds wimpier than it is. It's not, it's just very, projections are very, very powerful things, and they can be, especially unconscious projections. But that said, the people who have actually done these kind of things say, no, you're talking about something that exists autonomously in its own right. So, and again, when it comes to scientific proof, we don't have any. I'm simply going on the experience of people who said that they have done these things. If you ask me if I believe in ghosts, yeah, I don't know again, kind of like I don't know entirely what they are, what I'm experiencing. Like I don't know always entirely how to label it. But that's kind of the idea. It's something numinous. It's something other, and that perhaps is part of us or part of everything, and it just represents parts of us that we don't understand enough about. But I don't think that when you die, it's like your car. When the battery in the engine dies, that's the end of it. And you use it for you see if you can revive the parts or give them away. But I don't feel that way about the psyche. I feel like it, but I also don't feel like the psyche originates in the brain either. That's a whole separate discussion, but let's see. Okay, so on life after death, this is also from his Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, is his kind of autobiography that Jung wrote. And he says this interesting thing. I remember reading this in an article from the Atlantic Monthly too, on Jung and this kind of thing. And he said, well, the man who despairs marches towards nothingness. The one who has placed his faith in the archetype follows tracks of life and lives right to his death. Both, to be sure, remain in uncertainty, but one lives against his instincts, the other with them. The difference is considerable and gives the latter an advantage. Now, some people would disagree with Jung on this, but he's saying if you go through believing there's nothing, you say, I don't know if there's anything, I'm going to assume there's nothing. So therefore, it's a despair. When you die, there's literally nothing left. The archetype is the one that suggests that there is an archetype of the soul, that there is something. So the person who believes in that says they're following through. He says neither person knows whether there's anything after death, but the person who believes that there is something lives a full life and does not despair that that there's that everything that they've done is over and for naught. You know what I mean? I think we like to feel that our life impacts something or has some kind of a lasting effect. So, and that and Jung is saying here that he believes the human instinct is to believe in that. That can be evidenced by the fact that the earliest forms of religion were burials, and that's from Neolithic times. We're talking thousands and thousands, many more thousands of years than we can think about. So the fact that that has always been an impulse in human consciousness tells you that he feels that makes it a very human instinct to believe in life after death. Now, there's other people who are atheistic who say, yes, but because I don't believe in life after death, therefore I live my life now. I guess you could. But, it's, the questions always arise when a person is about to die. There are some people who have never believed in anything, and on their deathbed, they're like, yeah, I'm dying, whatever. There's an inscription even from ancient Rome. I think it was written by a Stoic philosopher. Was it a Stoic or was it a Epicurean? I can't remember. It was one of those two groups, but they had said it was something like it was something like I was, I'm not, now I'm not, and I do not care. It was something of that nature. I have to find the exact inscription, but there was an epitaph on a tombstone, on a grave, that basically said, I was, now I'm not, and I don't care. It's just like, whatever, yeah, I lived, blah, blah, whatever. So, it's not that people cannot believe in that and not feel that way, but by the same token, I think when that moment, when your life is going to end, it's sort of like what really goes on there. I've known people who've been atheists their whole life at that moment see things differently. So, I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule about that, but this was Jung's idea that, it's better to follow the archetypes. It's better to think that there is more than meets the eye here, whatever that may turn out to be. Okay. Okay, so as I mentioned, that ancient underworld, I just gave you all the characteristics of it. When we get to Homer, Plato, and Virgil, okay, so we'll look at three different things here. Okay, the Nicaea and what they call the Deuter-Nicaea, which means just a second Nicaea in the Odyssey. So you have the account of Odysseus and necromancy, which I mentioned, but also in the very last book of the Odyssey, there is, it's called the Deuter-Nicaea. And it shows the god Hermaeus joyfully leading all the souls that Odysseus has just killed, all the suitors for his wife who were hanging around and being malingerers in his house all these years. They've all been killed, and now they're on their way to the underworld. And and some of the souls from the Trojan War, like other souls, like Agamemnon, who was since killed by his wife, and even Achilles, they come and they see the suitors and they ask what's happened. And Agamemnon makes the comment of Odysseus has a really good, Odysseus can count himself lucky. He has a really good and faithful wife, unlike some people's wives, because of course Agamemnon was murdered by his wife. So, but he has this whole speech about how women can be so unfaithful and ungrateful and uncaring, but not Odysseus's wife. He had a fine woman, because Penelope is her virtues of hospitality are being exalted as her being a very fine woman. And so, but in that case, you also see this underworld where, Hermaeus acts as what they call a psychopomp. He is the person who brings that's the person who, pomp is like a procession. When you graduate, they play pomp and circumstance. Pomp is processional. So, but psycho means procession of souls. So the leader of the psychopomp is the god Hermaeus. And as we mentioned, he passes his way between the different worlds. So Hermaeus or Hermes or Mercury, however you want to say it, he takes them into the underworld. So we see these different angles of the underworld as Homer knows it, and that is the one that I'm talking about here. It's just everybody goes there during the Nicaea, that underworld journey. Odysseus sees Achilles, who has died, and great Achilles, and Achilles says, better to be a slave alive on earth than a king in the underworld. He says it's terrible. But in other versions, there's other stories that put Achilles in the Elysian fields, and so I don't know, it depends. There's always differing stories, but certainly in Homer's Odyssey, that's the vision of the underworld that we see. Now, when we get to Plato and we get to the philosophers, they're influenced by something called Orphism, which is Pythagoras seems to have been an Orphic. Pythagoras, the mathematician who was also a philosopher, and they were influenced very much by the religion of Zoroastrianism and perhaps other influences that may even be from the Far East. But there was a version of this Zoroastrianism that came as what they call Orphism. Now, Orphism is not really a religion; it's more of a movement. It's like if we talk now about the New Age movement, which incorporates a whole lot of different stuff. And it's the way you can mishmash things like vegan living with Buddhist meditation or something, things that don't necessarily or things that don't necessarily go together, but in this particular context, it's more of a way of looking at the world. And I talk more about that in that other lecture, but basically they believed in immortality, or they believed that you could at least move to a better place in the underworld. You could lose your fear of death. And so Plato, in his Republic, book 10, writes this thing called the vision of And the vision of is a story of a man called and some people believe is supposed to be either Pythagoras or Zoroaster. And it's so is a soldier who has died, and they're about to put his body on the funeral pyre, after so many days, and then he pops back to life and tells them his vision of the underworld. Okay. And his vision of the underworld is such that basically you have souls that have died, and they spend, depending on whether they were good, if they were virtuous, they get to rise up to a favorable place, like a heavenly place. And if they were wicked in life, then they had to go be punished in Tartarus. Okay. And at some point after they had either earned their reward or punishment, they had to come back, and the fates, they would draw lots and they would choose a new life on earth. And the idea was that one didn't want to forget their previous life because they didn't want to forget their lessons. So you had to be careful. When you drank from the river Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness, that's the first thing the dead do when they get to the underworld. And that makes you forget life and forget your previous life. And what the idea was, well, don't drink the waters of Lethe. You want to remember, because then when you go back, you will not make the mistakes you made before. Because he gives an example of somebody who eagerly decides they want to be a king, but then when they finally see their lots from the fates, they say, "Oh no, I'm gonna be murdered and die a horrible death." You know what I mean? Like there's to be careful and to be circumspect about the kind of life that you choose. And of course, the fates are there spinning the lives and casting them like dice, they're like lots, and the people had to go and choose from what was there. And so the vision of is one of the earliest ideas of judgment after death, at least in ancient Greece. This is where we start to see this idea that of the underworld as a place, not only as a place of judgment, but the idea, he talks about kind of what reincarnation type model, they refer to it as metempsychosis, and where you receive a certain amount of reward or punishment in the afterlife, but then you come back again. And it's the first time you see the idea that people who are virtuous somehow rise up. Okay, that is definitely not a concept that existed before. It becomes something non-chthonic. And eventually in Neoplatonism, Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, you see the entire underworld moved into the sky. Like Hecate becomes part of the realm of the moon. That's where she ends up becoming associated with the moon instead of with the caverns under the earth, because she's the gatekeeper, and the sun is considered to be like the celestial, everything. But then people who have to fall back to the earth and to the underworld, like those are the wicked people. It's a whole different way of talking about it. And we see another solidification of this view in Virgil's, in the Book of the Dead, which is in the Aeneid. Aeneas is very much following a journey. He's another Trojan War hero, but he's Rome's Trojan War hero. Like he's actually from Troy. Like Odysseus and the other heroes who were mentioned in plays and in Homer's epics are all considered to be Greek or Achaean, or they're from that region. Aeneas was somebody who fought on the side of Troy, and he's the son of Venus or Aphrodite. So he's coming to Rome, and he follows a journey quite similar in many ways to Odysseus. I think it's meant to mirror, Virgil was trying to mirror Homer's Odyssey in that way. And what he does is he goes to see the Sibyl of Cumae, who is very similar to Circe or Circe in this case. She's the witch or the Sibyl. And he travels to the underworld. He has to go collect a golden bough. And a bough is a branch. In fact, George Fraser's work about mythology called The Golden Bough is based on that idea that he has to get this golden branch. And if he's able to get the branch, then that means he can travel to the underworld. So of course he does. And the Sibyl takes him there and guides him through all the dangers of the underworld. But the fact that he has the golden bough, he's allowed to pass into the other world and to go see Proserpina and give that to her. She's the Persephone, the Roman name for her is Proserpina. And so once he's able to do that, then he's able to go visit his father Anchises, who has just died and now lives in the Elysian fields. But the underworld he describes there, you see the Furies or the Erinyes punishing the wicked dead in Tartarus. And then you see the good souls going over to the Elysian fields. So now, you're starting to see this split. But my point is that this split was not original. Okay, there's sort of, once you started to get rational philosophy involved, and that's also, by the way, when you started moralizing about the gods, that's when you started to say, Zeus should not be cheating on his wife. Like, you started to take the moral attributes of the gods and that's why we kind of have the idea now that the ancient Greek gods were, that they were, that's why people have a hard time understanding Greek religion because of the morality of the gods. They say, oh, well, the Greeks were just making gods like themselves. They were making it totally humanistic. Like, oh, they just made gods in their own image. And it's not really exactly true. There's many traits of the Greek gods that reflect human psychology, but they represent forces that are experienced outside of yourself that are beyond your control. And that's the whole point. The Greek gods aren't moral, and they're not about morality. There's nothing about Greek religion that's about morality. There's certain codes that you observe in tribal societies. The main two being xenia, which is hospitality, and dike, which is justice. So, you take something from a neighboring tribe, you have to make a reparation. That's expected. If someone comes to visit you, you welcome them and you give them gifts. And you never violate that. You never kill your guests or harm your guests. And therefore, when you travel abroad, if they recognize you, they need to welcome you into their home. This is a way of protection in this kind of a time. Those were the only kinds of morals, you might say. And obviously, there was customs and things like that people followed. But religion was not moral. Here's where you start to see the morality in religion. And it starts not only with judging people's character and the way that they behave in life, but now judging the way they behave in death. And that's where religion becomes moral. And this is where we start to have a modern version of religion, where we assume religion is about ethics and morals. Okay, it was not to the ancients. It's not the way it went. But here you can almost see that progression. And I don't consider it an evolution. It's just, it's how things changed. Okay, so let's finish up by talking about some of the major chthonic deities of ancient Greece. There's Hades, Persephone, then there's Rhadamanthus, Minos, and Iacchos, which are the three judges. And again, the idea of judges are a much later idea. Okay, they come in, you don't see them in the original, like you don't see them mentioned in the Odyssey, for example. There's Hecate, we talk about Hermaeus, we talk about Kerberos, and we talk about Charon. So let's go through them. Okay, Hades. He's the brother of Zeus, okay? And when their universe is divided up, as mentioned, Zeus gets the celestial realm, Poseidon gets the sea in that realm, and Hades takes the underworld. And he's a very passive figure. There's not that many stories about Hades. The two major stories about him are when he abducts Persephone. Okay, and this is because Aphrodite sends her son Eros she says she's going to extend her kingdom to the underworld. So they shoot Hades with the arrow. And the first thing he sees is Persephone picking flowers, and he falls madly in love with her and tells his brother, and his brother gives him the green light to go ahead and take her away. So he comes driving up in his chariot, grabs a hold of her and takes her away while Demeter's not looking. and thus starts the whole Demeter's quest to find her daughter, because she doesn't know what's happened. And Zeus doesn't say anything, of course. And the other story is about Theseus and Pirithous. Theseus is the one who defeats the Minotaur. There's another story about that among the Greek hero myths. But Theseus, his best friend Pirithous, they both want to get brides for themselves. And Pirithous decides he wants Persephone, queen of the underworld. He wants to abduct her and take her away to be his wife. So Theseus, being his best friend and bound to help him, goes with him to the underworld. And so they approach Hades and they tell them what they want. And Hades, yeah, sure. Have a seat, guys. And they sit down, and then they're stuck in the chairs, and they're called the chairs of forgetfulness. And they're trapped in the underworld. So it's eventually Heracles comes and is able to remove Theseus from the underworld, because Theseus wasn't really guilty of anything. But Pirithous, when he tries to free him, the whole earth shakes. Like Hades won't allow it because Pirithous is guilty and he's going to stay. So it's and if anyone tries to leave who doesn't, a dead soul tries to leave, Hades, that's when Hades gets angry, and that's when you feel the earth shake. Persephone is his wife. Now, the story is very interesting of Persephone and Hades. She's taken away by him, and apparently this was not something planned by her or that she wanted. But then Demeter goes on this long journey to find her, because nobody seems to know what happened to her, and she's very distraught. And she ends up going to this kingdom where she disguises herself an old woman, and she takes care of the children. And this is very similar to the story of Isis and Osiris in ancient Egypt, where she decides to try to make the children immortal. So she puts them into the fire, and she does this ritual. And then the mother comes and screams and sees her doing that. And then she finally reveals herself as Demeter and says, I was going to make your children immortal. But instead what she does is she gives the son Triptolemus the gift of agriculture, to spread the gift of agriculture so that they could grow crops. So, she's grief stricken, and in her grief, she decides to make the earth barren. So, and eventually, and this is after she eventually encounters Hecate, and the goddess Hecate tells her that what she's learned. And she says, yeah, Persephone is in the underworld. This is why Hecate lights the way there in the darkness. And then once Demeter finds this out, she's enraged, and she makes the whole earth go barren. So Zeus has to negotiate with her. And so first they said, okay, Persephone can come back, but the pomegranate seed, while she's in the underworld, you see Hades is trying to give her, and she's refusing all the food of the underworld. And finally, she managed to take a single pomegranate seed. Sometimes people say she took 7, sometimes it's 1. In any case, she takes the seeds. And that's a very mysterious moment. I have a podcast on Persephone where I talk about this. Because the implication there is that she's forced to take this, and because she's eaten the food of the underworld, she can't leave. So the compromise is that she spends part of the year with her mother, and that's when spring happens and summer, and then part of the year with Hades, which is when winter comes and her mother is missing her. But that said, a lot of people look at this as an abduction and rape story. But the interesting part at the end, if you read the original Greek, when she's discovered and her mother says to her, you didn't eat the food of the underworld, did you? And she said, how did she phrase it? She said something, it was translated something like, my husband tricked me and now I'm in love with him. And now I feel love towards my husband, which upsets her mother terribly. But the question then becomes, did she take those? Because the implication is that even though she was upset at being taken away, she does actually develop an attraction to her husband. So she eventually takes the seeds, and pomegranate seeds, by the way, are kind of an aphrodisiac. So the idea is that, he's the kind of man she shouldn't fall in love with, but she doesn't want to tell mama. So there's a twist to that as well. There's a lot of implications. I actually wrote a paper called, I think it was called 50 Shades of Grey and Pomegranate Seeds, because I'm looking at the way of elements of what we call shameful sexuality. ways in which the woman is not supposed to do things, or scenarios in which the woman absolutely, should be enraged or should, be, not, but that's not what actually happens. So I don't want to go off on that tangent here. That's anybody who wants to read that, I'm happy to share that paper with you. It's a little bit controversial because some people think like, oh, well, you're defending somebody who, no, this is, remember, gods are archetypes of things. And in this way, Hades becomes almost the archetype of the, in a way, it's a variation on the star-crossed lovers, because it's that bad boy that mama and daddy don't want you to have anything to do with. Okay. So he's like an archetype of that. I mean, that's, as such, he's more of a motif in that way. Like, that one that, my daughter is virtuous and doesn't like somebody like that. There's an element of that. But the myth of Persephone is also to a certain degree about girls coming into womanhood, because there's a certain violence to that. There's a certain violence about being dragged into a world where now you're sexual and sexually active and menstruating and bleeding and all that stuff. And your childhood is kind of torn away from you. So it's more metaphorical of that than any kind of a story about any kind of social level story about rape. You have to be careful with that theme in Greek mythology, because it's never entirely what it appears to be. Sometimes it is, but this is not one of those cases. You have to, the story, the idea of that is horrific, but for women. But if you get beyond what it's trying to say there, and you have to remember, you're not dealing with human beings, you're dealing with gods. Just like the siblings commit incest all the time and stuff like that would be horrific from a human point of view. But something else is going on here. It's trying to convey some other kind of thing, some other kind of process that's happening that is traumatic in its own way. Okay, the three judges of the underworld. They're demigods, they're sons of Zeus, all of them. And they established law and order when they were alive. Minos particularly is considered to be, he was the king of Crete, and he was considered to be the ideal king. Okay. In fact, Minoan civilization is named after Minos. He's supposed to be that great king. And because they were so great at their job, they were made judges of the dead, in the underworld. I actually need to find the date of that particular story, because I'm trying to think if that's something that we see in Ovid or if we see it earlier, because, and it's surprised I actually haven't really given that a whole lot of thought before, but yeah, it's definitely a later story, because the earlier ones, there was no idea of judgment and death. You died and that was it. So this would have been at least from Plato's time, maybe onward. Hecate, triple goddess here, goddess of witchcraft, moon, ghosts, and necromancy. Many people are familiar with Hecate. Apparently she's been mentioned in several TV shows like Sabrina and some of the other ones. That is the one podcast I have. I have two parts to it, because Hecate is a very complex figure. And it's gotten over 15,000 listens on YouTube. And I thought, ooh, this is a popular topic. So, but Hecate is this goddess, and mainly she's usually shown with torches, and she lights the way in the underworld. Hesiod describes her as one who, she's actually described as a Titan. She's considered to be a Titan goddess. And she is, and she's one of the ones who, after the war with the Titans, doesn't lose anything, because she's considered to be so auspicious. And so how later she becomes associated with the underworld, it seems like she was a goddess with a particular role, because she was also had a protective role. You would have the Hecate on in front of your house to protect your house. So she has this protective role, and it seems like she originally had a lot to do with childbirth as well. But Artemis ended up picking up a lot of her attributes. In fact, I will often say that Artemis and Hecate are like mirror images of each other, one being in the underworld and one being in the above world. But Artemis has taken on a lot of characteristics of Hecate, probably the original Hecate. So the story that we see for her in the Homeric hymns is that she's helped Demeter look for Persephone, and frequently she's depicted with a black dog and a full cat, and holding two torches. So, and she, travels her way. She's associated with crossroads. Hecate suppers would frequently be left there. But the whole idea is that in the darkness and unconscious of the underworld, Hecate lights the way. Hence her association with things like witchcraft and things like that, because really what the magician is often doing, occult is a word that means hidden. And so it's the idea of uncovering hidden knowledge. So Hecate helps one uncover the hidden knowledge in the darkness. Hermaeus is the messenger of the gods. And again, we've gone through Hermaeus' story. He's the son of Zeus and Maya. And this is kind of this is a repeat from the 12 Olympians slide. But Hermaeus also, as I've mentioned, is a psychopomp. And his role in dealing with the underworld is that he brings souls of the dead to the river Styx, and where they will pay their fare to Charon, who we are going to talk about next. We have Kerberos and Charon. Kerberos is a three-headed dog that guards the gate to the underworld. He's in the image that you see on the left, that's Pericles carrying him off. That was one of his labors, was to bring Kerberos back alive. So he does. And of course, scares the pants off of his, the king who keeps ordering his labors. And but Kerberos is, and generally Kerberos can be beaten if you need to get into the underworld for some reason and you're a living person. You just bring some bread soaked in wine and then throw it to Kerberos, who will eat it, and then he'll fall asleep from the wine. And then you can just pass by him without being injured in any way. But Charon is the ferryman who takes you across the river Styx. And so the idea was that you had to have a coin in your teeth. So you had the coin, like we mentioned in the Eros and Psyche, or Cupid and Psyche myth. Psyche has to keep the coins between her teeth, and Charon takes the one coin, and then she has another coin to get her back. So he collects his fare to take people across. So when the dead were buried, in funerary rites, they always had a coin placed between their teeth for Charon to take them across the river Styx, which is the river that takes you into the underworld. If you were not buried properly, you did not have the fare for Charon, then you were left on the shores. Then you became one of the Aori, or the restless dead. And that was a much worse fate. So this is a basic introduction to the Near East, Greek, Roman underworld. I don't get into the Egyptian because that's not too much, because that's really an entirely separate subject. But these are the stories that we have, and this gives you a basic overview of that progression. I mentioned a few other residents. The Erinyes, or the Furies. These are very, very ancient goddesses, who we mainly see them in the Oresteia, where Orestes, who is the son of Agamemnon, when he has to kill his mother, he's then pursued by the Furies. I mean, that was to avenge his father. Apollo insists that he kill his mother because his mother killed his father. But now, so he has to avenge his father's murder, but then the Erinyes pursue him for the crime of matricide. The Erinyes always had to do with crimes in the family. Like, they didn't care if you killed your spouse, but, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say. They didn't care if, somebody was married outside of family and someone got killed out there. It's like, okay, that doesn't have anything to do with your family. Like, it's what has to do with your family. If you killed somebody within your family circle, you were pursued by the Erinyes, which in a way are somewhat, they're manifestations of guilt in some way, but they are there to torment. And they also appear in the Aeneid. They're called upon by Juno, or Hera, they place serpents in the breast of Turnus to invoke wrath in him. So, but they reside in the underworld, and it's said that the restless dead, especially women who are restless dead, become assistants to the Furies. The Fates are there, the Moirai. They're the ones who they spin. One of them spins the thread of life, one measures it out, and the third one cuts it. And that determines the life. And there's even the gods cannot get around what the Fates have determined. You have, so the Erinyes, here's an image of them pursuing Orestes. I'm going to go through, because each one of those on that list, I'm going to go through here. So there's there's this image of the Furies attacking Orestes. The Moirai, here they are, Clotho, Atropos, and Lachesis. And as you can see, one spins, one measures, and then one cuts the length of the threads of life. Hypnos and Thanatos are the gods of, that's literally sleep and death. Okay, so the two of them, and you notice that death is a winged figure here. And Hypnos is the god that brings sleep. And of course, they're considered to be brothers because sleep and death are considered to be very much akin to each other in the way that, you're basically unconscious. It's just in one you never wake, the other one you don't ever wake up. And then, finally, we talk about the Gorgons. We have talked about Medusa, but the Gorgons are also creatures that live in the underworld, kind of the watery underworld, watery section. So they're associated with the sea because, as we mentioned, the underworld is either in a cave. It's usually by a body of water, usually under the sea somewhere, but in some deep cavernous realm of the earth. So the Gorgons are also creatures that are associated with the chthonic realm. So that's that. That's an introduction. Again, I get more deeply into this in another lecture. For those who are taking this as a university course, I'm probably going to stop there because that's for that particular introduction, this is all that's really needed. But for those who are taking my other classes, there's going to be another section that gets more deeply into that middle section about when we move from Homer's view to Plato's view and so forth, and then how we eventually get to the modern Jewish Christian view, Dante's Inferno and so forth, and this idea of heaven, hell, purgatory, things like that, which are definitely not part of the ancient model. In one course, and then within this particular course, part 2, I'm going to get more into the Orphic beliefs about the afterlife. But so that's going to be the end of it, though, right here for now. And so we will. I'll stop there. I won't ramble on. And then I will see you in the next episode.